Welcome to Attican Plays Railway Empire. All right, hi, this is Attican, and welcome to another Railway Empire video. We're in our continuing pursuit for perfection. We are going to take a shot at the automobile, which is one of the more difficult scenarios, and so naturally it would be a very difficult one to make a perfect score on. And we're going to make sure that we just kind of do it, play it my way. I'm going to play it my way. And the big thing here, though, we are going to use the engineer, which we've been doing in this series, and it's the strongest character. It just is. I'm having a hard time imagining how you could play with anybody else unless you just really want to make it a more difficult game, and then that might be a legitimate reason. So what we're going to do here is do a rapid expansion strategy using the engineer. So that's where it's going to depart from the last couple we've done in this series where we used the pass-through rural stations. This one has a big city growth element in it. We have to grow 3 cities to 120,000, and we have to grow Toledo to 200,000. So we're going to use a rapid expansion strategy. But I'm also looking at this and thinking that the key cities on this map are St. Louis and Rochester because they are big enough to have a second industry and they don't have one yet. So there's slots open. And on this map, we need a refinery and we need a steel industry to get going. And they don't exist. And unless we want to build one ourselves, and unless we're playing as Roger, that's probably not a wise thing to do with such a small amount of starting money. We want to work our way to St. Louis. In our system, we want St. Louis and Rochester to eventually play. So what I've decided to do here is run a rapid expansion, beer meat, and work toward Rochester. So we've got meat in Chicago, we've got beer in Rock Island. So we're going to go over there. It's a nice short run, and we're going to hook that up as a beer meat line. And then we're going, where the engineer's going to help us out on this is, we're going to be able to buy the 4 trains we like to have running back and forth on these beer meat lines for pennies on the dollar. So 70% discount. And then that money we save is going to help us continue to expand. So again, I'm going to speed up a little bit because I don't want to go through all the city building, but let's just say I'm going to build a line with 4 trains on it, automatic line. Point-to-point connections, Chicago, meat, Rock Island beer. As this is flying by, you'll see another beer meat line between Rock Island and Rochester. Then you'll see another beer meat line from Rochester to the beer up in Duluth, and that'll give us 4 cities in our little rapid expansion. And now we'll start running cattle into Chicago, which is the next phase of rapid expansion. Now, the question you might have is why St. Louis and Rochester? Well, I started to explain it that they have open slots for industries, and we're missing the steel and the refinery. In other words, to be able to produce the steel with the steel industry, which is needed for the cars, and produce the gasoline, which is needed for the cars, because this one's all about building cars, basically. So what happens here is, from playing around with this quite a bit, whichever way you grow out, if you want to grow toward Toledo and Grand Rapids and that area, that would be great. You could do beer meat there and have really good lines. And we know Toledo's important to us. We want to grow there anyway. But if you go that route, what you'll find is that that first steel industry is going to pop in the east somewhere, and it's going to be really hard to get the coal and iron ore. The iron ore is easy, it's close, but there is iron ore close by, but the coal is going to be a pain to try to get it there. What you really want to see is a steel industry and look at that, in Rochester or in Duluth. So we see that a steel industry has already been created there in Rochester, and basically it's because we built toward Rochester and got it started. I do believe, and I couldn't swear to this because obviously, I'm not going to test it enough to make a definitive statement, but I believe had we built back toward Grand Rapids and Toledo, we would see Grand Rapids or someplace with a steel industry in it. We really want that steel over there to the northwest, close up there because there's coal and iron up there just north and west of Duluth, and that's a beautiful location for our steel industry. And that's the first tough task we have is to ship a bunch of steel. Well, to ship it, it's got to be created and it's got to be supplied with coal and iron ore. So that's why we are really focusing on moving this way. But the biggest thing here is, and the approach I've taken, is to build these beer meat lines and have profitable lines. And you'll notice, even though that steel industry is over there, I think at this point I hadn't even noticed it. I just noticed it now as I'm doing this narration. But eventually I do, but it wouldn't have mattered because what I'm doing now is following the rapid expansion strategy, and I'm putting that meat into Chicago, and I'll end up putting wheat into Rock Island because I want at least part of our beer meat kind of deal to be really functional and to keep these cities growing. We have to especially keep Chicago growing because it's already big, so it's a logical one to grow to 120. It's already like 90 or so. So obviously that'd be one we would want to target to get up to 120. But the biggest reason that doing this is to stay with a method that we know we can repeat, the rapid expansion, and to get that profit, to get these nice cattle lines and these nice wheat lines running that are going to have these trains coming in at a regular interval to these beer and meat cities and making us good money. So here comes the wheat going up to Rock Island. So at this point, we start turning our attention to getting that steel industry going. And I think if I could do it again from this point right here, I would keep going with the, at least get that meat into Rochester and probably the cattle, or wheat rather, up to Duluth, so that the beer meat lines would still keep flowing, maybe even go down to St. Louis and get some wheat going down there. But at any rate, at this point, it was time to get the coal and iron moving into Rochester so we can start producing steel. And what I'm doing here is setting up another runway, if you will, into a different station. I want to, of course, use that same track. No point in building more track up through there and having an expensive bridge and all that. The track itself, the track between two major points is usually not your problem as far as traffic control. Your traffic control problem, of course, is at the station itself. So by giving it that extra runway, moving off to a different station, we shouldn't have any traffic jams at all. So what we're going to do here is run coal down, piggyback on that Duluth line, and then go down and run it into that new station we just set up. And we'll set up coal that way, and we'll set up iron ore that way. So we're just wrapping up our setup of the coal and iron, and now we want to do something that's very important for keeping your production up. We're going to set up a small warehouse out here just outside of Rochester, making sure its catchment area doesn't hit Rochester. And we're going to run a train that just basically has the job of taking steel out to that warehouse. Now the reason we're doing that is because you can only get so much production out of that car industry in Chicago, and the line to Chicago is quite expensive. But by building this short line right here, we can run one train, a little supply tower, one train, one track actually, out to that warehouse and keep the production going of the steel. Because the only way we could do that otherwise would be to go ahead and have a line that runs all the way. We need the Rochester to Chicago line Plus, we would need a line from Chicago to Toledo because that's where the cars actually go. That's the demand for the cars. Plus, we would have to have our oil already set up because without both the oil and the steel, after a short time, the car industry is going to shut down in Chicago and not demand any more steel. We wouldn't be shipping steel down there at all, and our whole production chain here would just choke and die on us, and we wouldn't be able to build, we wouldn't be able to create and ship steel quickly enough. Now, when I say create, we don't own that factory, but we wouldn't be able to continue shipping coal and iron down, and the steel production would stop because there wouldn't be any demand for it, and the whole system would shut down. So that warehouse is key to keeping the production moving while we get everything else going, because you can't do both at one time. There's just not enough money to set up refineries and oil delivery and set up steel industries and coal and iron delivery and set up the lines all the way back and all that stuff. You got to kind of work on what you can work on. So we're setting up the steel first because that's what is asked of us first in the objectives, and we're using that warehouse to make sure that that production keeps going. Now, because we have a steel industry and we have coal and iron going to it, and we have that warehouse to keep the production going, we can now turn our attention to the oil. So we're going to, we've noticed that there's a refinery over in Indianapolis. I was kind of hoping it would be built in St. Louis, which is much closer. Turns out it was built in Indianapolis. That's okay. We can deal with that. So, again, my little theory about what spawns these factories is not perfect and hadn't been researched thoroughly. So the idea that we, build out to Rochester, maybe we just got lucky and got the steel there. In fact, I will tell you that I have run tests on this where I actually got this. This was almost a killer. I got the steel in St. Louis, and I got the refinery in Rochester. But that, you can make that work. You can make anything work if you try hard enough, and if you have some nice economy going like we do. We have decent economy. We're making money at a pretty good clip here because of our rapid expansion start. And so we have a decent income, nothing to brag about, but decent enough to keep us going so that we can build these lines. So we're going to build a big line here all the way from the oil, which is south of Kansas City, all the way over to Indianapolis, to the famous oil refineries of Indianapolis, Indiana. And the nice thing is once we get the oil line going to Indianapolis, then that gasoline line is a nice short haul to Chicago. So that'll be pretty easy pickings for us to get that over there. So now we've got oil flowing to Indianapolis to the refinery, and now we need to be able to ship the oil to Chicago to be used in that car industry. Got a nice short haul here. We just need to set up the line, and we're going to run an automatic line from Indianapolis to Chicago. And you'll notice there I couldn't put a second line in because all I've done so far is put in the first station, and I've got it running out to the oil, but it's not actually connected to our network. It's kind of running independently. So what we'll have to do is connect it into the existing station first. And once we have that connection, then we can kind of break the connection and put in the second station that we want. Well, let me put it that way. We can put the second station in, then we can break the connection and run it to where we want, which is actually the second station here in Indianapolis, turned back to back to that the one that's already there. So we'll put in a new station and then hook that Indy-Chicago line into that new station, and then we'll have a good little city-to-city deal going with a way of shipping the gasoline over to Chicago. Now we have a city-to-city line going to Chicago, But keep in mind, we got the same problem here with the oil that we would have with the steel that we talked about earlier. We don't really actually have the steel going to Chicago yet. So the demand for oil is going to kind of dry up, if you will, as soon as we get a few units shipped up there to Chicago, because it's not getting steel, and it's going to shut off orders saying, number one, I don't have any steel. Number two, I don't have any orders for cars because I don't have a connection to Toledo. So we're missing the connection to Toledo, and we're missing to deliver the cars, and we're missing the connection to Rochester to deliver the steel. And there you can see we just finished our steel shipments in plenty of time, so looking good there. And so we've got to do the same thing, similar thing that we did for the steel. We're going to set up a warehouse. Now the good news is this time, it's so close to Indy, we can actually put it right there attached to Chicago. And that oil, anytime that Chicago needs the oil, it can pull it down. Gasoline, sorry. Anytime Chicago needs the gasoline, it can pull it down and use it. But what I'm going to do here is keep that city-to-city line intact, and it'll occasionally grab oil and take it straight to the city when there's a demand for it. But we're going to have a separate line here, building a separate little runway for it, and we're going to have a train just sit there in Indy and get full with gasoline, and every time it's full, it'll run and drop that off in the warehouse, and that way we'll get a nice steady flow of gasoline into the warehouse, which will allow us to keep our shipments up and allow us to hit our next target, which is to ship 50 boxcars of gasoline. And see, we've got it running full to the warehouse. Well, trying to, once I realized I didn't put my switch in front of that warehouse. And I don't know how you guys are finding it, but I find that because you've got now the super stations that have the switches already built in, and then sometimes you use the ones that don't, sometimes I forget that you got to have those switches on anything but the super stations, or you can't use both tracks. So fixing that little faux pas right there, and now I can build a line from Indy over to the warehouse, and for the purpose of storing gasoline for future use, and also to help us right now hit our objective of shipping 50 boxcars of gasoline. So it's time for us to start thinking about our city growth. We have to have 3 cities hit a population of 120,000, and we've done almost nothing to do city growth now, except for some little beer meat lines, which really are not going to get us anywhere near that. So it's time to get Toledo in the act. So I absolutely want Toledo to be one of those 3, because we want to go ahead and move it all the way to 200,000. So what we're going to do is set up a line, a city-to-city line between Chicago and Toledo, because that will allow us to start shipping cars to Toledo. It'll be a good line, even though it's not a beer meat line, and we need that connection to allow us to ship the cars, because that's another task we have, is to ship 50 automobiles. And the demand is in a special warehouse in Toledo. It creates the demand for the automobiles. Now at this point, we're in good shape on our gasoline shipments, because we've got our refinery in Indianapolis. There is a refinery in Indianapolis. We're now supplying it with oil. We've got a train running it over to that warehouse. And so we're looking good there. We're good on our steel. And so we need to really focus on city growth, though, because we've got a really tight window to get 3 cities to 120,000. And Toledo's so-so size, maybe 60-ish now. And Chicago's around 90, and we're going to pick 3 cities, and the third one's going to be Rochester. We're just going to grow them almost like one city cluster. We're going to make sure that they have what they need to grow. We're going to make connections to other cities if we need to bring goods into the cities, but we're just going to do whatever it takes to make those cities grow. And you can see Toledo's actually in decline right now, the opposite of what we're looking for here. So now we're finishing off that line we were first looking at to connect Chicago and Toledo. And I realized that that line is going to be expensive, and it really isn't worth as much as it could be if we can't get that steel down to Chicago so we can start making automobiles. So if you take into account the fact that we need to run a line from that steel warehouse we have up there near Rochester down to Chicago, plus we need to get the Toledo line, decided to hold off and use the old close the bonds, open bigger bonds technique so that we can have some serious money to play with here, because we need some serious money right here to get all this done. So we can see we're in pretty good shape on the gasoline, and we've been accumulating money. We've closed out one of our two bonds, and now we've got enough money to close out the second one. So we're going to go in there and repay the second bond, and now we'll open up two bigger bonds, and now we've got ourselves $1.1 million to play with. Now we can do some damage. Now we can get that line from the steel warehouse up there near Rochester down to Chicago, start running that steel, because so far shipping into that warehouse is just a cost. It's costing us the investment plus maintenance and supplies for the train. But now the trains that come back down to Chicago can drop it off, and then we'll actually start seeing money on those shipments. So we're going to start shipping that steel down to Chicago out of that warehouse, and that's going to enable us to start producing. We've already got oil coming to Chicago, either directly to Chicago or into the warehouse. So now once we start this shipment, then we can start creating automobiles in Chicago, or at least someone can. Whoever owns that automobile industry down there, that car manufacturer, can start making automobiles, and we can start shipping them to Toledo. That is to say, once we get our Toledo line set up. Remember, we got it kind of halfway done and decided to wait and pay off the bonds. And now that I think about it, I should have just deleted the Toledo station and deleted this line and been able to close off the bonds faster, but just didn't think of it. So now we're going to finish off that line and have our city-to-city line from Chicago to Toledo, make us good money, but of course its main purpose is to ship automobiles from Chicago to Toledo. Remember, I said that we would almost treat these cities like one city clusters. So what we're going to do here, I've got enough money now. The money's starting to come in. We're starting to make money. We're looking a lot better. So what we're going to do is put in a super warehouse attached to Toledo. And in that warehouse, we're going to run the items down here to the south that the Toledo needs. We're going to get the cattle that it needs. We're going to get corn. We're going to get fruit, and we're going to get logs, and run those directly into that warehouse. And that will give us some good demand satisfaction or demand fulfillment in Toledo, and will help us try to keep that growth rate over 60 so that we can grow the city. And remember, Toledo is extra challenging because we can't put in a museum, because the special building slot is taken with the automobile warehouse. So let's move ahead. We'll skip all this building, but we'll basically just piggyback, and we'll build this line, then the corn will attach into this line, the fruit will attach into the corn line, and the logs lastly will attach into the fruit line, and they all end up down there at the warehouse. All right, so we got all those set up and running into the warehouse, and what we need to do now is we need to get beer into Toledo. I can't believe I've gone this far on this map and not built a line from Toledo to Grand Rapids. Doesn't seem right, does it? But what we're going to do here, we've got a a beer industry in Indianapolis, and there's wheat near it as well. So what we're going to do here is set up a city-to-city line, which will be a beer meat line between Toledo and Indianapolis. And the main purpose is to feed the beer into Toledo. So again, it's kind of a one city cluster, so you're thinking about what does that city need, and obviously we get that cattle in there, that'll give it the cattle and the meat. And once we get this set up, then we'll have beer flowing in. So we're starting to get the fundamentals. We're starting to get the logs and the corn and the cattle and the meat and the beer. So we're starting to look better in terms of the fundamentals that Toledo needs. And we're just going to build almost ground up, getting the fundamentals and then seeing what else can we supply Toledo with to keep it growing. Now, since Indianapolis has the important job of supplying beer to Toledo to keep it growing, we want to make sure that that beer industry has a steady supply of wheat. So we're going to run wheat directly into Indianapolis so that the beer industry there will always be supplied, and it will actually send beer over to Chicago, although Chicago already has sources for the beer, and especially to Toledo so that we can keep Toledo growing. Now, as this flies by, you'll notice that we put corn and wheat directly into Toledo. We also finally set up a station in Grand Rapids, and we're going to run corn over there. And to tell you the truth, I think when I first saw that bonus indicator, I thought there was a connection bonus. Turns out it's really a new industry. So this is great. This is even better, really. So what we're going to do, we get a bonus for putting in industry, so it's not going to cost us too much. And we're going to put a Taylor in, first checking to make sure there isn't one that I can connect to Toledo. So what's going to happen here, this Taylor in the 1910 time frame, the Taylor doesn't, you don't need to have the weaving industry. The tailor takes cotton and turns it into clothing. So we know that there's cotton fields just up to the northeast of Grand Rapids, and we know that Toledo could use clothing, so this is great. We're going to set up, now finally, we're going to set up what I almost always start with on this map, the direct line between Grand Rapids and Toledo. And it's going to be your basic city-to-city line, but its main purpose now is it'll bring some beer down, make sure that Toledo has beer, although we know we're already getting beer from Indianapolis as well. But the big thing it'll do is bring that clothing down. So now we've got one more item, one more demand that's going to be met in Toledo by having that connection with Chicago. And what we'll do to make sure that that works is we'll make sure that the clothing industry has cotton sent directly to it. So let's wrap up this first part right here. We have connected a bunch of cities by using rapid expansion strategy. We've got Chicago and Rock Island beer meat. We've got beer meat from Rock Island to Rochester. We've got beer meat up to Duluth from Rochester. We've also got beer meat from Chicago down to St. Louis. We've also connected Toledo into this. It's actually meat, but it's the main line where we're going to deliver our automobiles from the factory in Chicago. We saw the Rochester steel industry get created, so we moved coal and iron down there. We put it into steel into a warehouse. Now we're shipping that steel directly to Chicago for manufacture of cars. We did the same thing in the other side down on the south. A oil refinery popped up in Indianapolis. We ran oil from all the way over down south of Kansas City over to Indianapolis. Now we've got a line and a warehouse near Chicago where we can store gasoline, and we've got the gasoline and the steel all set up and going to Chicago for that car industry to create cars, which can then be shipped to Toledo. And as we leave off here, we're in the middle of what is really, kind of arguably the hardest thing. Actually, they're all pretty hard on this one. But getting these 3 cities to grow to 120,000. So we'll come back and work on that and continue and probably finish off this scenario in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it'll help you become a better player, and I hope you'll join us for our next Railway Empire video. Thank you.